The Security Weekly News wrap-up for the week of 7 August 2022. OnlyFans strikes back. Windows versus Linux. Conti. CISA. Zeppelin. Not that Zeppelin. NHS. And all the show wrap-ups on the Security Weekly News. Stick around.
This is Security Weekly. For security professionals, by security professionals.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week. Your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for Security Weekly News.
Right now, everybody is talking about cryptocurrency, and the cyber criminals are hiding in the conversation. Cyber criminals use social engineering loaded with urgency and fear to successfully prey on your company, your employees, and your customers. Spear phishing is just one of the 13 types of email threats. Barracuda has identified 13 types and shows you how you can protect your company, your customers, and your reputation. Find out about the 13 email threat types and Barracuda email protection by going and getting your free ebook at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda.
Monitoring and maintaining compliance is a never-ending struggle with a high price of failure. FIREMON helps customers meet complex and varying compliance requirements. FIREMON has fully customizable reporting, analytics, assessments, and dashboards to meet the compliance needs of any organization. With FIREMON, compliance reports take a tenth of the time, and real-time continuous compliance eliminates the anxiety and headaches of audit preparation. Improve security outcomes by improving security operations with FIREMON. Visit securityweekly.com/FIREMON to learn more.
All right, I'm Doug White, and this is the Security Weekly News Wrap-Up Show, episode 231. Wow. On Application Security Weekly number 207 this week, John and Mike had Chingur Ari, the co-founder and chief architect at INSO Security on the show. That episode was about the current state of AppSec. I mean, obviously the show is called Application Security, so they're always doing something about AppSec, but it was the current state of AppSec, and they were mostly looking at why AppSec fails. So, like, what are the things that lead to AppSec failure in the process? I could give you a few. But the main topic was what they were calling Agile AppSec. So, yeah, so that's a new term, I guess. And they were talking about how you can get to this Agile AppSec stuff with some reorganizing, some management approaches, and so forth that would let you really focus on underprotected software. So definitely check that out if you're in that domain. And in the second segment, the AppSec news. On Business Security Weekly number 272, Jason, Josh Marpet, and Matt did the leadership news first. And in the second segment, Sasha Zedler, the Senior Vice President of Security Assurance at Salesforce, was on the show. And Sasha was on to talk about Zero Trust, which is obviously a very big, it's the AI buzzword of 2022. So Zero Trust, you see that on everything, every product, et cetera, et cetera. But what they were talking about was how this is like all these buzzwords, whether it's machine learning or all this stuff that you see, it is just a buzzword, and that you can't just buy Zero Trust. And I really like this, and I saw that, I was like, I really was interested in that segment, because you can't, we say this about, it's like machine learning. You can't just buy machine learning and turn it on and it's all going to work perfectly. It is a journey. It's not just a click of a remote to get to Zero Trust. So definitely check that out. On Enterprise Security Weekly 284, Adrian, John, and Katie had on Ryan Freed, a senior engineer at Brook Running. Ryan was talking about how to start small and look proactively for evil under every rock and stone in your environment. So definitely an interesting segment there. In the second segment, Joseph Carson, the chief security scientist at advisory CISO at Delinea, was on, and the segment was about it was a pretty interesting segment. How do you follow along in the footsteps of an attacker? So not just I'm going to pull down a bunch of logs and things and sort of see what happened, but how do you get from there to actually understanding the attack, sort of a kill Cheney kind of thing? How do you identify their digital footprints? And they went on, how do you get from zero to a full domain admin compromise with some ransomware? So just looking at how that attack evolved. And in the third segment, the Enterprise Security News. On Security Weekly News number 230, Jason returned from the Alpha Quadrant and talked about phishing and Coinbase, along with a bunch of multi-factor issues. It was good to have him back. And on Paul's Security Weekly number 751, the security news was up first on that show. In the second segment, a special segment by Paul and Tyler, we're talking to Jesse Michael, who's the principal researcher at Eclipsium, and Mickey Shakatov, a security researcher at Eclipsium. And they were talking about something that's near and dear to Paul's heart, as we'll see in a little bit, but about secure boot vulnerabilities. And obviously these two are two of the biggest researchers around in this area. And they talked about the history of secure boot, how it works, and research they did on what's called boot hole, and some other research that they're presenting at DEF CON, which is starting up this weekend. So definitely a great segment. It's a real opportunity to hear from some of the most knowledgeable people in the field about secure boot. So check that out if you missed it. The threat of the week for me is going to be conformity. And we all conform to something, but at the end of the day, this article has this headline that got my attention, and the headline was, quote, "Businesses should dump Windows for the Linux desktop." So this was the headline. And I mean, that immediately got my attention. And I've seen that headline, since, back in the 80s. I mean, you've been seeing this whole debate. And there's always this, the barroom brawl debate about Windows versus Linux and so on with different people. I mean, and that's what the headline says. And we've been hearing it since, the first DOS 3.0 machines rolled out, and all us mainframe types were upstairs making fun of those pathetic little machines that couldn't run MVS and had 320, floppy disks for storage. So don't get me wrong. I love Linux, and Linux desktop, not so much, but I do love Linux, and I love Unix. And I've used so many different versions of Linux and Unix. I couldn't probably list all the ones that I've used. I mean, I've used Xenix, BSD. I mean, you name it, I've probably run it somewhere. Maybe I didn't run it in production, but I've probably installed it. I probably set it up, swore at it, got it working, and then, turned it off. But when Linux really took off, there were so many distros, from SUSE to Gentoo to Ubuntu to Red Hat. And, we could just list these things all day. In fact, they saw a chart of the lineage of Linux once, and it looked like some kind of Schrodinger family tree or something, or maybe a map of the freeway right there by the New York airport, if you've ever seen that. But I love Linux. I mean, it's everything I always wanted in an operating system. It's adaptable, it's manageable, it's what you make of it. And if you don't like that distro, there's a different one over here that's based on some other tree, and you can play all these kind of games. And I've built tons of Linux servers. I mean, I've built a lot of them for clients. I built them for me. I built them for school. I built them for anything and everything. Whether they were lab machines, dev machines, prod machines. I built desktop machines. I built servers, and so on. I mean, if a client wants a server for insert the name of just about anything you can ever think of, I probably built it out of Linux, or maybe even Unix if it was long enough time ago. I used to use CentOS all the time, and then I got into Ubuntu server, and I still love both those platforms. And I know we can go have a slap fight about all these things and which one's better and blah blah blah. But I mean, at the end of the day, CentOS was a very good platform. Ubuntu server was a very good platform for a lot of different purposes. And and you've probably heard me mention all this stuff before. My old friend Lou. He wanted a music workstation in every room of his house so you could sit down, plug in, and jam wherever you happen to be. Now, Lou and I were always getting ourselves into all kinds of trouble, because usually it was because he couldn't resist a challenge, and I love to choose the most difficult path, which always results in a big challenge. So, of course, we picked Gentoo. We didn't pick Windows. I said, why don't we build it out of like a Linux platform? And Lou was like, and I was like, how about Gentoo? And Lou was like, what's that? And, And I don't mean those fancy schmancy modern versions of Gentoo. I mean one of those old versions where, you finally shoved red hot needles into your eyes because it really seemed more pleasant than spending more minutes, trying to get this thing to work. So I ended up spending days just getting the video drivers to work for the machine. And then I spent more days trying to get the sound drivers to work. And then Lou told me he wanted to use his Turtle Beach sound cards that he had because he paid a lot of money for them. And he had one for every room. And they had all these connectors so that you could do ins and outs like a music machine, like a real production type music machine. And so after a lot of gin and tonics and a bunch of cigars, he was smoking cigarettes, but I was smoking cigars. We finally got it to work. I mean, it was crazy how much time I spent on this, but we got it to work. So back to the matter at hand. I like Linux. I mean, I said that before. I love Linux. I think it's one of the best things that I've ever encountered. And because of my longevity in the security and the tech community, I know that when I see Microsoft, and this is the conformity on the tech side, I'm supposed to gag and spit and bash it, because it's Microsoft. And so according to this article, GitLab decided that you could run Mac OS or Linux, but you can't run Windows on your desktop at that organization because, and this is the part I don't like, they said it is the most targeted by spyware, viruses, and ransomware. I don't disagree with that statement. I mean, it's very true. The most common desktop out there in business and at home is going to be the one that's targeted the most. And the article goes on to describe how, Windows was built on a platform that had no consideration for networked environments and all this kind of stuff that we all know. I mean, until Windows 98 Second Edition, there wasn't even a network stack in Windows. It was horrible. I mean, I was like, what? I mean, of course, when it first came out, nobody cared because there was no networking really. So, we were doing ThinNet or something, and it was all running on Novell and all this stuff. But a lot of things that Windows does with file shares, DLLs, OLEs, and all these things were basically designed for convenience over networking at a time when networking was just starting to come into play rather than any kind of secure or safe operation. So back to AppSec and all that kind of stuff, because there was no such thing as AppSec. Their goal was the goal that tech people had all along, which was make it work. I call that the old school engineering model. It's like, just make it work. Don't worry about it. And the same thing with coding and all this other stuff. Just make it work. That's all that matters. And, that's what businesses wanted. Businesses didn't want a more expensive product that was harder to implement. They wanted it to work. They wanted to have it installed quickly and easily. They wanted it to work. How do you get the job done quick? And, and it's going to be a tough sell to get people to worry about security. And all of you know that. I mean, we never stop with that, right? How do you get AppSec involved? You don't. It takes too much time. And then it's too late. And so Microsoft just now worries about it when some user finds it somewhere and they report it. So what's my point? Well, honestly, I don't know. I mean, getting people to dump Windows to use Linux. Okay, so if we start with that, well, for tech people, that's easy. So if I just go to a bunch of you and I say, why don't you use Linux instead of Windows? You go, well, I'm already doing that. I love to run, Linux. It's an easy sell to the tech people, really easy. But the minute you want to turn this around, and you can think about this from your own context, and you want to push this out, onto your corporate desktops that for users that you have to support or secure or whatever role you have, it's like, then you immediately start looking at it and goes, well, this doesn't support Linux. We run this product and that doesn't run on Linux. And, and I know the Linux people are already jumping up and down and banging their shoes on the table and saying, oh, anything can run in Linux. You just have to work on it. And I'm like, yeah, it can. It's just about how much effort do you want to put into that and how well will it actually run. And that's one thing if you're playing in a lab. It's another thing when you've got 4,000 machines sitting out around the world that you have to support. Just recompile it. And maybe it'll work. But there's no drivers or no libraries. And that, that first time you try to compile it under that Linux setup with GCC or something, and it produces 6,765 dependencies that you have to fix first. That starts to put a damper on the spreadsheet users. I mean, it really does. And if, at home, it's the same problem. I mean, if I try to push this onto my dad and say, why don't you quit using Windows, Dad, and use Linux instead, it's so much better, blah, 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 I would have spent all my time supporting that because, it would have been a constant problem. So the problem that with this article is that it bashes Windows for security, but it sort of fails to address a couple of things to me here. One is Linux is not necessarily secure either. It's just not as common that people target it. And the users of Linux tend to be more knowledgeable, except when they're not, and they set everything to be world writable because that made it work. And two, Linux, even Linux desktop can be just really, really challenging for end users. I mean, this is just me talking from my experience. And when we roll those things out and it's difficult, it becomes a problem. And it is a chicken and egg problem. Until some critical mass of Linux users exist that will write common commercial software for it that's usable, popular, and stable, businesses aren't going to adopt it. Businesses don't want to play that game. They don't want to have to hire, old mainframe days. We have to hire a staff of engineers just to develop and support this very proprietary thing that we have when there's other stuff out there that people are actually asking for because that's what they have at home, that's what they learned in school, and so on. And I know it's a chicken and egg problem. And I know that just because you learned it, that doesn't make it the best thing. But I did have a company a long time ago, I think in the 80s, and we were trying to sell this product and training to people on spreadsheets. And we weren't that excited about Lotus 1, 2, 3, but that's what the businesses wanted, so that's what we taught. And, and getting them off that was the only way they ever got off of Lotus 1, 2, 3 was Lotus became so absolutely adamant that they would not add mouse support. It was just that we're Lotus. Nobody will ever turn away from our software. And then people started using Excel because you could copy and paste. I mean, I don't disagree that Microsoft has a nasty stranglehold on the market and that maybe that, Microsoft's products are not the most secure and that they are heavily targeted. I do agree. And that between Office and Windows, they pretty much own the business world. But that's a really tough world to break into when you start trying to limit what people can do. You start trying to tell people, well, yeah, you're going to have to do this and this and this. I do think when the day comes that there's a Linux desktop that's simple, cheap, and has business software companies want, not just business software that might work or that you can use. That's the open office dilemma. And it's got to be what they want. Then businesses will adopt Linux. But in the meantime, they aren't going to because of the esoterica and the security flaws that haven't yet affected them and so on and forth in Windows because they don't see it that way. So the real problem is that if Linux, say some distant relative of that old Gentoo that I was working on, became the dominant OS in the world and it had a super cool, easy-to-use desktop, well, it might well then become the most targeted system. So the logic that GitLab was using to me doesn't really hold. In the end, you should use what works for you, but you should fully understand the risks and mitigate them as best you can. I mean, if your networked Linux desktop has world writable files, it's going to be a problem. I mean, and somebody probably will target you. So is Windows awful? Yeah, probably, but it's hard to avoid. I have all kinds of software at school that, I could probably maybe get it to run on Linux somehow. I mean, I've experimented with stuff like that before, but it is really, really difficult, and it takes a lot of time. And then I have to try to show students how to do that. And then that takes even more time, and then it goes wrong. So I really do love Linux, don't get me wrong, but I just can't imagine setting up a Windows server for any serious purpose. I never have. I've never promoted Windows servers for anything. But for my end users, just the thought of trying to build out, 4,000 Linux desktops for a company makes me shiver. But it's an interesting conundrum. And now the news. Well, just to let you know that Paul, in his never-ending quest to make me look bad, wrote another really nice post about firmware and not only explains things like Ring -3, which if you've heard him say that on the other show and you wanted to know more about it or you wanted to have a good explanation to share with other people, but goes on and demonstrates tools that you can use for free to check your systems for firmware vulnerabilities in this blog post. I do think he should do a SPI mod demo because he talks about that a lot. I think that would be a cool thing to see somebody actually do. So you should probably read this article. It's really well written. It's a very clear explanation of some of these firmware type vulnerabilities and how to test for them. So those two articles, I did one a couple of weeks ago, and then here's another one. So check those out. CISA added 2 flaws to their catalog of known exploited vulnerabilities that are being actively exploited. The first one is called Dogwalk, and it is a security flaw in the Windows Support Diagnostic Tool, which is called MSDT. And there is publicly available exploit code for it. The vulnerability will allow the attacker to push an executable into the Windows startup folder, so the next time you reboot, it's going to run. This problem was reported by Imre Rad in January of 2020, but apparently the report was misfiled as non-security risk, so they didn't do anything about it. Jusine, which is another online blogger, refocused that this year and provided a video proof of concept that Dogwalk actually can be done. And Microsoft said that it does require user interaction to execute. So I guess that was part of their, that, oh, well, it's not that bad, but people are doing it. And I mean, social engineering. And so an unofficial patch for this had been out since early June from the OPatch micropatching service for most versions of Windows. And Microsoft did finally patch this in the August security update. So if you've not evaluated that yet, you may want to. Microsoft noted that the exploit has been used in attacks. So they did acknowledge that it was being actively exploited. The second one they added was UNRAR. So UNRAR, if you aren't familiar, is a decompression. So RAR is an alternative to zip. It's just a different compression algorithm. and UNRWA is used on Linux. So this is all, this is kind of reinforced. In fact, I found this story because I was reading about Linux versus Windows kind of stuff. This UNRWA bug is a path traversal bug in Linux and Unix, and it can basically be used to cause something to be extracted into an arbitrary target while it's being decompressed. So Sonar Source reported this issue in June and illustrated how it can be used for remote code execution by compromising a Zimbra email server. So if you're looking for other articles on this, you can Google Zimbra email server and you will find several. But they were able to do this. They were able to run the code without authentication. There is exploit code for this in Metasploit as of August, so it's obviously out there. This addition to the list from CISA means that federal agencies are expected to apply updates for both of these and patches by August 30. So if you're in a federal agency, you need to get on that. The U.S. Department of State announced a bounty of $10 million for information on 5 Conti ransomware members, which included a photograph of one of the alleged members. The program at State is called Rewards of Justice and was apparently titled by someone who didn't speak English very well. But it is a program that pays out monetary awards, bounties, on threat actors who are targeting U.S. safety and security. Now, this program was originally launched to target terrorists. So when they first put this together, they were trying to get people to give them info on terrorist cells or other extremist groups that might be working inside the United States. But they've now expanded this to include cyber threats. So they're considering cyber threats to be terrorism. And I'm not arguing. I'm glad they're doing it. They are currently offering bounties and or have offered bounties on Sandworm, Revil, Evil Corp, as well as others. And they put up a picture on this ad that says that it's the Conti member that goes by the handle Target. And so they put an actual sort of doxing photo of this person up. And the wanted poster they have says they're also looking for Tramp, Dandis, Professor, Rashev, and also list that they want information on anybody with TrickBot and Wizard Spider. So they're just basically saying, hey, if you know some hackers, you want to turn them in, we might pay you. Conti ransomware, I'm sure you've heard of it, has been responsible for well-known attacks in the city of Tulsa, Broward City Public Schools, Advantech, the Irish Health Service Executive and Department of Health, among others, and was originally called Ryuk, of course, which just about everybody's heard of. They rebranded it later. Right after the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia, Conti announced they would be supporting the Russian government, which was a very unpopular move. And apparently, even to Conti, they'd forgotten that they had Ukrainian members who got a bit upset about this. And reputedly, the Ukrainian members released over 170,000 internal chat conversations in the source code for the Conti encryptor, which basically ended up shutting down the Conti brand. I mean, they just had to disband. And of course, all these internal chats allowed investigators to start trying to figure out who the high-level members of Conti were. So even though that brand is shut down, of course, the members are still are active and they're doing other ransomware operations and so forth. So if you want to make $10 million, there's an opportunity. CISA and the FBI reported on Zeppelin ransomware this week. They stated that the encryption engine may well encrypt all of the files on the drive multiple times. So the FBI said it observed multiple instances where Zeppelin was executed repeatedly in the same network, which resulted in encryption of encrypted files and then re-encryption of the encrypted files. And that resulted in different IDs and file extensions for each instance, which meant that every time you decrypt it, you get another encrypted file that you have to pay another ransomware for. So this was requiring multiple decryption keys for a single instance of ransomware. The most recent FBI report of an attack was on the 21st of June. That doesn't mean they've stopped. It just means that was the latest one they got reported on. The ransomware started out being called Vega Locker and then was called Burin. It was called Vega Locker again, Jamper, and now it's apparently called Zeppelin. The actors have apparently been in operation since around 2019, and they target businesses and critical infrastructure organizations like defense contractors and tech companies with a particular interest in healthcare and medical industries. The group has used double extortion in the past. Double extortion is where they not only encrypt all your files, but then they threaten to release documents into the wild if you don't pay up. and they typically make ransom requests in Bitcoin. The FBI did request, if you detect Zeppelin ransomware activity in your network, please collect and share any related info with the local FBI field office, which is easy to do. And then they're trying to collect data on this so they can further track down maybe who this is or how to stop it. They said that valuable data would include boundary logs, which show communications to and from foreign IP addresses, a sample ransom note, communications with Zeppelin actors, Bitcoin wallet information, decryptor files, and samples of encrypted files. So, anything you can collect, I'm sure they would appreciate. The FBI does not encourage paying ransom demands, and it may not help. It may just cost you money, and then they re-encrypt you again. Or like Zeppelin, well, maybe you just bought the first key, and now there's another key you need to buy. Do you want to buy the second key? Well, how about the third key or the fourth key or the fifth key? So it's just one of those nasty, nasty things that is another reason not to pay ransoms. Since we're on ransomware anyway, managed service provider Advanced confirmed that a ransomware attack disrupted the 111 service for the NHS in the UK. 111 is the UK version of 911 in the United States, and NHS, well, that's the National Health Service, but the US doesn't have that. 7 solutions provided by Advanced have been impacted directly or indirectly. The attack occurred on the 4th of August and caused a major NHS outage across the United Kingdom. Advanced did not disclose what sort of ransomware was used in this attack, and they didn't really give any information about how the attack occurred, but they said they had taken action to mitigate the risk and isolated the environments where the incident was detected. Microsoft Dart and Mandiant are working with Advanced on bringing everything back online with new and added defenses. And Advanced said that other customers may be offline for 3 to 4 weeks. The attack affected Adastra, CareSys, Odyssey, CareNotes, CrossCare, Staff Plan, and eFinancials. The Federal Trade Commission in the United States announced an effort to begin formulation of privacy rules related to online monitoring and poor data security, a la GDPR or something like that. The FTC has invited comments from the public about commercial surveillance practices prior to writing any rules. The tone of the call, using the word surveillance, probably suggests they're not fans of said surveillance. A quote from FTC chair said, quote, firms now collect personal data on individuals at a massive scale, and it is and in a stunning array of contexts, end quote. Currently, the U.S. doesn't have any federal privacy law and has relied on states to pass these, but only California and Illinois have passed any laws that deal with individual privacy. A current piece of legislation called the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, or ADPPA, was approved in committee last month in the U.S. Congress, and it is awaiting votes from the U.S. House and Senate. But the FTC rules, which are different from that, so FTC rules apply to publicly traded companies and others, but the Senate and the House don't like that the FTC is trying to pass these rules since they haven't passed their rules yet. So they may never see the light of day. And there's different political parties which have vastly different views on privacy and the ability of corporations to harvest your information. And one party I could name probably would support the harvesting of your organs without your permission if they could get away with it. But we won't name any names. So we need a federal law, but we'll see if it actually happens. Likely will depend on the November midterm elections in the United States, because whichever party's in control will vastly affect whether or not there are privacy laws being passed. And you can pick whichever party you want to be the bad guys. I'm not going to try to tell you. And finally, when people were locked up at home during the pandemic, they turned to OnlyFans for adult entertainment. And the unknown company became a $1 billion app that has grown continually since then. It is projecting revenue 5 times increased over 2020 at this point. A new lawsuit filed on their behalf against Meta, which is Facebook's parent company, and this was in the form of multiple class action lawsuits representing adult entertainers, claim that senior Meta executives accepted bribes from OnlyFans to shadow ban competing adult entertainers by placing those containers on a so-called terrorist blacklist. Meta said the claim was highly implausible and defended OnlyFans. So basically what was happening was OnlyFans was getting their entertainers promoted, and other adult entertainers from other platforms were saying they were being put on a terrorist watch list so that their content could not be aired on Facebook or their ads or whatever. I don't really know exactly what they were doing. Lawyers for the aggrieved, that would be the adult entertainers class action, said that Meta will have to hand over a bunch of documents. And I mean, high-level corporate executives never lie or take bribes. Come on. But the watch list is the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which was set up. Forum, the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which was set up in 2017 by social media platform to try and counter terrorism and other violent extremists from using their platforms. Well, so they have this initiative to block people, and now somebody's getting bribed to put people on there by OnlyFans, who has a lot of money. I don't know. I guess time will out, as they say. And that is the wrap-up for the week of 7 August 2022. I'm Doug White. We'll see you next week on the Security Weekly News.